I would like to call the meeting to order now, please. I'm Connie Anderson, and I want to wish you all a heartfelt welcome to the Scottish American History Forum, and to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holiday Season. And as most of you know, there are some newcomers on this morning, I believe. But as most of you know, the History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division at Chicago Scots, which was formerly named Illinois St. Andrew Society, and which was founded way back in 1845 over here in America. It's the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois. And it was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, located in Riverside, Illinois. Now, Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of our Scottish culture, in addition to support of Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. So for additional information, just please check our website, www.chicagoscots.org, and we ask you please to give generously to our charity. It's, oh dear, wait a minute, I'm trying to admit somebody. Oh, admit him in a minute. But we'd like everyone to give generously, if you will, to our senior care charity. It's a one-of-a-kind mission that all Scots can be proud of. Now, before we begin our presentation today with our esteemed professor, Dr. Martin MacGregor, just love that name, we'd like to have Gus Noble join us if he's on yet. Gus needed to enroll his two sons in classes this morning. Oh, Gus, I see you. Gus is president of Caledonia and Chicago Scots. He's led the Chicago community and the nation really for years and years. And Gus is going to greet everyone and give us an update on what's going on in Chicago and what's recently happened in Chicago.
Good morning, Connie. Thank you for having me and for organizing today's meeting. Greetings to everybody on the call. I bring you an update on last weekend's festivities here in Chicago. We had a full weekend of events happening, including a symposium, which was entitled Brain Health and Dementia Care, integrating innovations and best practices in Scotland and the United States. And as the keynote speaker at this symposium, we had the former First Minister of Scotland, who is the International Ambassador for Alzheimer's Scotland, Henry McLeish. And Henry spoke very passionately about brain health and talked to us about how he helped Scotland become a world leader in brain health and dementia care. And because Henry had agreed to do it, all of the kind of preeminent and blue chip universities and organizations in Chicago and in Scotland said yes. So we had Northwestern, University of Chicago, University of Illinois at Chicago, Rush University Hospital, Stirling University, which as an alum, I have to say is the best university in the world. They have a Dementia Services Development Centre there, which is really the preeminent place for architecture and programming around memory care in Scotland. It was a terrific dive into the field, and we looked at dementia as it relates to public policy and advocacy in the law, then into public dementia as it relates to the environment, the natural, the built, and the social environment. And then we looked at care and culture and lifestyle. So it was a really kind of from high level right down to the immediate kind of person-to-person individual experience with dementia. Following day, we had our Feast of the Haggis, which is the St. Andrew's Day celebration and was the event that started the St. Andrew's Society in 1845 that you mentioned, Connie. And therefore, we celebrated our 180th anniversary. And as I remarked from the podium, and apologies to anybody in the Zoom room today who was also at the feast, but it bears repeating. a fraction of 1% of not-for-profits make it to 100 years. So to make it to 180 years is really quite something. And as the Consul General said in the programme, he wrote a very nice letter. British Consul General Richard Hyde wrote a letter congratulating the Chicago Scots. He said, "It's quite something to celebrate 180 years. And do you know that Gus Noble has been president of the Chicago Scots for 17% of that time?" And that made me feel very old. But it was a terrific event. We really had a great celebration of Scotland. And we're now looking forward to Christmas. And I wish everybody around the country that's calling in all the best for a very happy Christmas and good health and every happiness in 2026.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful report. Thank you so much, Gus. You're always here for us. And I know Saturday mornings are important in your family and taking your sons for all their educational programs. So we really appreciate you always managing to join us. Now, I just have one additional announcement before we begin, and that is that on January 10th, and I remind you, 2026, so Happy New Year, everyone, Dr. Matthew Jenneck will be back with us, and he's going to speak on pro-government militias during the 45, the Battle of Culloden, of course. And so I hope you'll all be able to join for that discussion. And now I believe it's time to move forward with our presentation today. We are so very pleased to have live from Scotland, Dr. Martin MacGregor, who is returning by popular demand. And Martin is a senior lecturer in Scottish history at the University of Glasgow, who will be addressing For Freedom Alone, William Wallace, Robert Bruce, and the First Scottish War of Independence, 1286 to 1329. Professor MacGregor, we're going to turn the floor over to you. If you can all mute your microphones and dim your cameras, that we'll ask you to unmute them and show your faces again after Dr. MacGregor's presentation for question, answer, and discussion. Martin, would you put your presentation up, please?
I will indeed. Many thanks.
Welcome.
I don't know. And you can still hear me clearly,
We sure can. Thank you so much.
That's excellent. And there we go. Just checking I can move through the slides. So, first thing to say is to say how delighted I am to be joining you again. It was a great pleasure to speak to you. Last year, I always greatly enjoy these opportunities to address wider audiences, and it's particularly as a particularly great pleasure to be able to reach across the sea to the Scottish diaspora and try and make connections and to perhaps bring some kind of awareness of what's happening within the study of history here in Scotland itself. So this time out, I thought I would turn to, I guess, pretty hallowed turf, we might say, in terms of Scottish history as a whole. We have in the title here names that we'll all recognise. Polls are regularly conducted asking people who was the greatest Scot of all, and I think these reveal a kind of worrying gender bias. Maybe that's one thing to say straight away. And then the first three places tend to be occupied by men, and it's the two here and Burns who tend to dominate the scene. And it's interesting to think about Wallace and Bruce, and the fact that sometimes it's almost presented not so much in Wallace and Bruce as Wallace vis-a-vis Bruce, or Wallace almost versus Bruce, as if we have two different versions of Scottishness, two different versions of commitment to the idea of Scotland. if we think of how the cults, if we want to put it that way, of the two men have come down through the centuries, Wallace looms so large, and I'll speak a bit about the historical Wallace in due course, but the myth in Wallace's case dwarfs the historical record, which at the same time we must remember was responsible for the creation of that myth. And Wallace in more modern centuries was recreated as almost a kind of working class hero, if you like, as representing the patriotism of the people, whereas Bruce has always been perhaps more associated with the higher echelons of Scottish society from which he came, of course, but also therefore with perhaps some of the more questionable traits which have fairly or not sometimes been associated with that class in society. And among those traits would be a question mark, which might be raised sometimes about the degree of patriotism at that level. So that's our two big figures, and they'll be central to what I talk about. The period defines itself very neatly for us. 1286, the death of a king, we'll come to in a minute. 1329, the death of Robert I, Robert Bruce himself, having come to the throne in very controversial circumstances in 1306. Somebody else will be appearing in the cast of characters is Edward I, Plantagenet King of England, and he and Bruce are often seen as we have a heavyweight contest, if you like, a tale of two kings in terms of how they face off and shape this period for us. But the three words that open my title there, they come from somewhere else. They come not from the realm of human personality, but from the realm of ideas. They're words taken from what is arguably the most famous single text ever written in Scottish history, the Declaration of Arbroath of 1320. Now, Arbroath, some of you will know, a small town on the east coast of Scotland, south of Aberdeen. So not a very conspicuous place in terms of the global map, but there are those who would be willing to connect what happened at Arbroath, or the text that is associated with Arbroath in 1320, with what happened in Philadelphia in 1776, in terms of the world of political thought that we're talking about here. So we have the possibility to explore today as to coming out of these tragic circumstances, this terrible war between Scotland and England, which was responsible for the devastation of much of Scotland, much of the north of England, and the war was of such intensity that it spread over the sea to Ireland as well as influencing much of Latin Christendom, people getting drawn into this conflict just because of the intensity of it. So we can never forget that we're dealing with that side of things. But we also have the fact that crucible, if you like, that crucible of human suffering and human testing resulted in some remarkable ideas coming to the fore. The Scottish kingdom was tested in a way that had never been before, arguably never been since in these years. And one of the products of that was this text, the Declaration of Arbroath. So let's move into it. Essentially, I'm going to provide a narrative, and I think in many ways it would be wrong to do anything else, because narrative is fundamental to history. Sometimes it's looked down upon as, we need to think about analysis, etc., etc. But narrative provides a form of analysis of the past, and here we are talking about one of the great narratives in Scottish history, exceptionally powerful story, and I wouldn't want to disguise that. I would rather that we can engage with that and we can think about thematic concerns perhaps when it comes to questions. Briefly, if we set the scene in terms of thinking about Scotland by the late 13th century, what stage were we at in terms of the development of this polity or kingdom? Well, Scotland was going places I think. Over the previous 2 centuries, its neighbour to the south had experienced conquest, been drawn into a vast trans-channel empire, seen its indigenous monarchy and ruling class effectively displaced. Scotland's experience of this kind of Europeanisation or Normanisation was a different one. There was no conquest. There was a coming to terms with these influences. So that we need to think of Scotland very much in that European context. We're not thinking of any kind of backwater here at all. Scotland is very much a fundamental part of Western Christendom, and trading with partners throughout this zone, and of course subject to the authority of the papacy as well. The Scottish Church in 1192 had been made a special daughter of the See of Rome, which meant in effect that there was no archbishop in Scotland. All of the Scottish bishops were on a par, and therefore the person responsible for appointing a new bishop when the time came was the Pope himself, which meant a journey to Rome. And this becomes very important in the context of the war, not only the question as to who was going to win papal support, but also these journeys to Rome and the opportunity that gave to raise the standard and to look for support as the conflict developed. But Scotland had come together as a kingdom. There was considerable cohesion. The border was fixed with England now since 1237 in the Treaty of York. The Western Isles, the Western littoral, had been absorbed, or perhaps we should say reabsorbed, into the kingdom through the Treaty of Perth of 1266, which was the kind of the setting of the sun on Norwegian domination of that zone. And church and kingdom are coming together. The authority of the king is also something that is critical now, and that's fundamental to identity, that all those essentially who acknowledge the authority of the King of Scots are therefore qualify as Scots, regardless of what their ethnic background might be or what language they might speak. And an idea, again, a form of words, sometimes we can think that maybe not much lurks behind words like these, but this particular phrase, communitas regni Scotiae, the community of the realm of Scotland, is a phrase that echoes in documents of this period, and the great late Professor G.W.S. Barrow, who wrote the, I think, still definitive biography of Robert Bruce, he believed that this phrase, this rather nondescript phrase, we might say, and encountered in the records of the time, essentially represented the idea of nationhood, of a step beyond a kingdom, if we can really conceive of such a thing happening still in the period of the Middle Ages. And I'm going to come back to that idea of the relationship between kingdom and nation as we go as well. Well, this kingdom was plunged into crisis in 1286 when its mature, very capable adult king, Alexander III, died in the middle of a storm en route to visit his new second wife, having left Edinburgh in the heart of that storm and headed across the Firth of Forth, and dying on the Fife side of the Firth. Now, crisis is perhaps overstating it, and I'll explain why in a second, but the issue was that this king, who a few years before seemed to have a line of succession which was cast iron, had lost his 2 sons in quick succession. His daughter, who was married to the King of Norway, had also died. That meant that his blood now only survived in the form of his granddaughter, Margaret, known typically in the history books as the Maid of Norway. Now, the point about Margaret was not only that she was over the sea in Norway at the point that her grandfather died, but she was a very young child, and a child who did not keep well. So the omens were not good in terms of what was going to happen in terms of the succession. And this, of course, is fundamental to the state of health of any medieval kingdom. Now, crisis, the reason why I think crisis would be overstating it is because provisions have been put in place for just such a scenario, given the death of Alexander's 2 sons and the fact that his blood was now surviving rather precariously over the sea. It had been agreed in a council 2 years before by the Scottish nobility that in the event of anything happening to the king, his granddaughter would succeed. And given her sex and given her age, that was quite a sign of political maturity, I think. Also mature was the way in which, in the wake of the king's death, the Scots come together and they elect, well, the traditional head count here would say that we had 6 leading Scots chosen to govern the kingdom in the absence of the king or the monarch until the Maid of Norway should come into her kingdom. Custodes is the Latin term. Guardians is the normal translation in English. And Barrow argued that there were 6 of these and that they represented an attempt to kind of cover the bases in terms of earls, that's the top secular tier in the kingdom, barons, bishops, so you're covering the clergy as well. And there were 3 from the north of Scotland and 3 from the south of Scotland. North and south here meaning north and south of the Forth, the line that connects the rivers Forth and Clyde. It's recently been discovered by my colleague Professor Dobbit Brun at Edinburgh, at Glasgow, that there was another guardian initially anyway, giving us a total of 7. He suggested that maybe having 7 meant that if you had any kind of vote on any controversial matter that you would get a clear decision. But there is, I think, in that 6 figure a kind of balance which is constitutionally interesting and is reflected in other documents and scenarios within our period. I think it adds to that case I was making there briefly for the fact that we're talking about a kingdom that's politically mature. I'll say a bit more when we get to the relevant point about how this kingdom was governed, because there are contrasts to draw with England which are relevant in the context of the war. Now, with Margaret on course to be succeeding to the throne of Scotland, that set the scenario for a potential union of the crowns. What the Scots also did very early on was to look to Edward I, the powerful king south of the border, to support them in what was an awkward time. Now that might seem, if we approach this from the perspective of Scotland and England as automatically enemies, that might seem slightly odd. It might seem slightly odd as well, given that Edward I had very recently conquered Wales and was a king with known imperial intentions, we might say. But he was also someone who was very well known in the European theatre as an arbitrator. He was also the brother-in-law of the late Scottish king Alexander III, and they had enjoyed a largely good relationship. So it's in that context that it's not surprising to see the Scots turn to Edward and asking him for his advice and support in this period. Nor was it surprising, I think, that we should move toward the prospect of a marriage settlement between Edward's own son, Prince Edward, future Edward II, and Margaret. This was something that was arranged by the Treaty of Salisbury in late 1289. And then we move in 1290 to another treaty contingent upon Salisbury, whereby the next slide spells this out in a bit more detail. It's a very important document, one that I don't know if you'll have heard of or not, the Treaty of Berghem. Bergham's right on the border on the Scottish side, on the Tweed. This was in July 1290. And the most important clause in that treaty said that Scotland, once this marriage took place, the Scots were obviously thinking this through and thinking it's quite likely that our Queen, Margaret, Queen of Scots, will be spending significant amounts of time south of the border with her husband, Edward II, when he succeeds King of England. And they're thinking through the potential dangers of that situation and how to ensure that the independence of Scotland was maintained in such a scenario within the context of a regal union. And the most important clause in Berghem said that Scotland was to remain separate and divided from England according to its rightful boundaries, free in itself without subjection. And that was buttressed by a number of other pledges, and these are pledges made by Edward I himself, promises he gives to the Scots covering all the bases in terms of church, law, taxation, parliament, the kind of various institutions, all essentially amounting to a thoroughgoing guarantee that in the context of this regal union, the two kingdoms would remain distinctive, one ruled by, in the first instance, in terms of this couple whose marriage is envisaged by the Queen of Scots, she rules Scotland, and her husband rules England. And when it comes to the future and children they may have, and the fact that we then have a dynasty which is covering both kingdoms, it would still be the case that an individual monarch would be monarch of a distinct Scottish and English kingdom. That was the vision of Burgham. So far so good, you might say. But at the same time, we are in this era when all depends upon dynastic, well, so much seems to depend, of course, on the health of the dynasty and the survival of human beings, the health and survival of human beings. And as I said, this young child was a sickly child. She had to face a long and dangerous sea voyage from Norway to get to Scotland, and in fact she never makes it alive to the Scottish mainland. She dies in September 1290 in Orkney in the Northern Isles, which were still part of the Norwegian kingdom. So now we might say that we are in a different scenario, a scenario in which this is unprecedented territory for this kingdom now. Who is going to succeed? We have a succession issue before us. And it was agreed, it was known from the first that we have two prime candidates who could trace themselves back, as we'll see in a minute, to the Scottish ruling dynasty, make their connections to earlier generations of that dynasty, independent of Alexander III's line, which has now come to an end with the death of his granddaughter. And the two were Robert Bruce, and just to be clear, we'll see this in a second illustrated for us, this is not the future king, but his grandfather, Robert Bruce, the competitor, as he's sometimes called. And on the other hand, we have a man called John Balliol. Balliol's an interesting figure, and I'll just say a word about him and his background when we get to the relevant slide in a second. Again, the Scots are looking to Edward, and perhaps with even more urgency now for help, because we have the potential for civil war within Scotland between these two. These are the two dominant political factions in Scotland. We've got the Bruces on the one hand. Balliol, I mean, that name is newish to Scotland, but he is connected intimately to the most powerful family or kindred or clan, if you prefer, in Scotland at this period, the Commons. So we'll see this in a second. So what line is Edward I going to take in this new scenario is the big question. And what we find when we get to the following year, Norham, we're back on the border, but on the English side this time, and it's early summer, May and June of 1291, is that the Scots are now confronted by a very different Edward I. We call the legal contest, which went ahead to decide who the next king was going to be, the Great Cause. What Edward did at Norham effectively was to establish a kind of de facto overlordship over the kingdom of Scotland, taking advantage of the vulnerability of that kingdom. There were various claimants to the throne. The big two I've mentioned, but in fact there were 13 ultimately who put their hats into the ring, by the fact that these two were always recognised as the serious claimants. But these claimants did homage to Edward, and that really, in a sense, pulled the rug from underneath the Scottish political community as a whole, because that meant that one of these people who was going to become the next monarch had already done homage to Edward, recognised him as overlord. Edward, who was very, very practiced and adept in situations like this, and also very, very intimidating on a one-to-one level, was able to use all of these actors that he had at his disposal, these gifts and talents of his in the political sphere, to his advantage at Norham. And he does not get an unqualified admission of his overlordship from the entire Scottish political community, but he manages to pick off elements within that community, and it gives him enough of a hold to allow him to go into this legal process to determine who the next monarch of Scotland should be as the judge. He is actually the judge of that process. What the Scots had wanted at Norham, what they had looked to, was for Edward to act as arbiter. As a result of what happened at Norham, Edward goes ahead and acts as judge. He has more power over the process. That's a critical point. So, what about the arguments from our big two coming back to them, John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Well, Balliol's claim was based on primogeniture, in other words, that his line of descent takes us back to the eldest daughter, as you'll see there, of Earl David of Huntingdon, and that he was the grandson of that eldest daughter. There's an illustration of this in a minute, so don't despair if this sounds a bit confusing at this point in time. The diagram's easier. Robert Bruce, as we'll see in a second, he couldn't argue by primogeniture because his line of descent was from Earl David of Huntingdon's second daughter, but he was one step higher up the chain of generations, and therefore his claim went by what we call nearness of degree or proximity of blood. So there we have it. Now, William the Lion in the top left there, that's the line. He was King of Scots in the later 12th century, but his line has now come to an end with Alexander III. So we have to go to his brother, David, Earl of Huntingdon, in order to determine what happens in the succession now. And as you see there, two of his daughters are named. He actually had three daughters, David, Earl of Huntingdon, but we've isolated Margaret and Isabel here. Margaret, the eldest, and as you see, her daughter, Gerivalla of Galloway in southwest Scotland, she marries John Balliol. And Balliol is, if you like, one of these kind of newcomers from the continent who are so plentiful in Scottish society in the 12th and 13th century, part of this Europeanizing trend which influenced Scottish secular society and influenced the church as well, hugely. The Balliols come from Picardy in France, and that marriage that Balliol makes to Gerivalla of Galloway is what gives him credence, if you like, street cred in a Scottish context, and it links him to the Commons as well. So he's the kind of face of that common faction. That's John Balliol, the father of the claimant in 1292 for the 1292 for the throne of Scotland through the great cause, John Balliol and Red. So he, the son of John Balliol and Gerivalla of Galloway, and going back to Margaret, eldest daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon. So that's primogeniture for you. And then to the right we have Isabel, second daughter, marrying Robert Bruce. You will see there the proclivity of the Bruces for the forename Robert. We've got four generations in a row, with Robert as the name of the male there. So there's Robert Bruce, the competitor, taking part in the great cause, and you'll see that he is one generation nearer to David, Earl of Huntingdon, ultimately. So that's the claim through nearness of degree. You'll see that he is his son, Robert Bruce dies in 1304, and his grandson, Robert the First, is the Robert Bruce that we are particularly interested in today, who becomes king in 1306 and dies in 1329. And the Bruces too had come from France in the 12th century. They'd come earlier than Balliol had, and they'd married again into the upper echelons of Scottish society. Robert Bruce, who dies in 1304, he marries the daughter of the Earl of Carrick, and succeeds to the earldom of Carrick, basically Ayrshire, southern Ayrshire, again southwestern Scotland. So you just see the way, and it's in a kind of sense, a microcosm. We're getting a sense here of how Scotland took shape in the 12th and 13th centuries, absorbing new personnel, new ideas from the continent, but it is this not losing itself in the process. It was a more controlled, considered process than what happened south of the border, when we can genuinely talk about a conquest. Balliol and primogeniture win, and this was as a result of this lengthy legal case, which becomes something of a cause célèbre throughout Europe. with Parisian lawyers being consulted, for example, at one stage. So this was a big deal. But on the 17th of November, 1292, Edward pronounced judgment in favour of John Balliol. There remains controversy about this. There is still that school of thought that Edward simply chose the man he thought would be the weaker man, the man he thought would be better able to exploit in terms of acting as overlord of Scotland. And there may be an element of unfairness there. The process, in a sense, has taken place in a very thoroughgoing manner, and many legal opinions have been heard and expert opinions have been held on what was, not a clear point of law at the time. But there are other arguments which we can maybe come to in discussion, which suggest that Edward was indeed looking to maximise his role as judge in this process. Balliol becomes King of Scots officially on St Andrew's Day, the 30th of November, 1292. And his reign has never really been looked at with great favour by Scottish historians. He's in a very, very difficult position. He does homage to Edward, having almost immediately in the wake of his inauguration as king, and he does homage again, as you see there, on the 26th of December, 1292. And in the months that follow that, Edward presses home his advantage as overlord of Scotland. And what he does particularly that undermines Balliol's position and ultimately leaves him in a hopeless position is using the law. Edward is a very, very practiced and skilled lawyer, and effectively what he was doing was subordinating Balliol in this respect, having cases that had been decided in Balliol's court referred to him, referred to Westminster, so acting as a supreme court, and Edward out-trumping Balliol in the legal sphere. So that meant that Balliol was not the chief legal officer, if you like, within his kingdom, as one would expect a king to be. Not only that, but he's humiliated in September 1293, being summoned to Westminster to explain a decision that he'd made in Scotland. So the situation was really untenable for the Scots. They have a puppet king, and they don't take kindly to the situation at all. This is a kingdom which is not used to this type of treatment, and indeed the treatment was unprecedented in a European context. And what gives the Scots a way out of the dilemma, the problem that they've got with their king, comes in 1295. What happens is that war breaks out between Edward, England, and France, and the Scots naturally side with the French. In the scenario, a treaty is made with the French, the Treaty of Paris, in October 1295. Not only that, but the Scots sideline their king. Now, this is quite remarkable, I think, and we'll come back to it in the context of our broth later on, perhaps. But what they don't do, is very important to make clear, is depose their king. They do not do that. They remove the administration of the kingdom from him, and they give that administration to a council of 12, which again illustrates that kind of constitutional balance, the makeup of that council, to take over the government of the kingdom from Balliol. Well, the fact that the Scots had made a treaty with Edward's opponents, his enemy, France, was of course tantamount to a declaration of war. So if we start with Alexander III's death in 1286, a decade on from that is when the First War of Independence now starts. And it starts at Easter in 1296 with Edward I's invasion of Scotland. Now, at this point in time, Berwick, right in the southeast of the country, was the leading town, the major town in Scotland, and its status was really founded upon its role as a trading borough, a trading port across the North Sea, trading with the Baltic states and the German states, and the Flemings, who actually had their own communities and headquarters in Berwick as well. So this is Scotland's largest and richest town, and at Easter in 1296, Edward sacks Berwick with a significant loss of civilian life. A month on, and the Scots, who hadn't really fought seriously for a century. War was something that was largely absent from 13th century Scotland, and it showed come April. Edward, on the other hand, is at the head of a very, very formidable and experienced English war machine, and the Scottish feudal host succumbs lamentably at Dunbar, not far from Berwick, in April. And it results in the capture, and this is a very important point, of a very, very high percentage of the Scottish political elite. They're not killed, but they are captured at that battle of Dunbar. Edward proceeds in a triumphant progress through eastern Scotland, and Montrose in July. The hapless King John capitulates to him. Toom Tabard, the name thereafter associated with John Balliol in history, refers to the fact that the surcoat that he wore with the insignia of the King of Scots upon it was taken from him. So empty coat was the nickname bestowed upon the king. Edward continues right up that eastern littoral as far as Elgin, and then makes a loop round to Berwick by August of 1296. Now, Edward was a multifaceted king and always alert, very, very politically astute, and he was very well aware of the importance of symbol. And what Edward took away from Scotland as a result of this conquest in 1296, well, there were various things. He took away a lot of the records of the kingdom. In a sense, he was trying to strip out, asset strip, if you like, those things, those objects, those artifacts which really amounted to a declaration of the independence of the kingdom. He was looking to take that out of the country. So records were removed, but also removed, and I'm sure some of you will know this, was the stone of Scone itself, the stone upon which kings of Scots had been inaugurated for centuries. And the symbolism became very powerful when that stone of Scone was incorporated into the English inauguration chair, King Edward, the Confessor's chair within Westminster Abbey. You can get a more potent symbol, I think, of the subordination of one kingdom to another. And this is really unprecedented in constitutional terms, what Edward was doing to the Scottish kingdom. That one Christian kingdom was being treated in this manner by the king of another. At Berwick in 1296, Edward having returned from this progress, the leading landowners of Scotland, in number, something like 1,600, we've got these records, come to Edward individually and they make their submissions of fealty to him. So Edward being given oaths of loyalty by the Scottish landholding classes, we might say. He leaves a regime behind to run the country, and they're going to run it on a different mode. It's going back to what I was saying earlier about the contrast between the fortunes of the two kingdoms over the last couple of centuries. England is running a way which is kind of unusual in European terms, much more centralised. Taxation is a big part of that. So the heavy hand of government is felt in England in a way that is just alien to Scotland, where we have a much more devolved, light touch mode of government. That's what the Scots were used to. So this was something that was going to create issues without a doubt, and the tensions begin to rise because of this type of regime. Edward, meanwhile, is headed off to pursue his war in France, but he does not leave behind a Scotland which is totally conquered by any means, quite the reverse. So this is the point in time at which William Wallace comes onto the stage of history. Now, we know very, very little about Wallace. We certainly don't know anything about what he looked like, and so that's been left to the imagination of painters and artists and Hollywood over the centuries. And I can agree that the portrait on the right there is unlikely to be close to the reality. Some of you may well have visited the monument which was set up to William Wallace near Stirling in the later 19th century. And we see there David Caldwell of the National Museums of Scotland with the Wallace sword. The myth said that Wallace had to be a giant of a man, that his physical stature had to match what he had done in historical terms. So a giant man needed a giant sword, and when they put a sword, this Wallace sword, we know that it was actually a sword that was broken in two to allow an extra section to be added in order to make that sword commensurate with the status of the individual who was meant to have wielded it. And of course, figures like Wallace, they become fair game for those in the political sphere across time. They become invented and reinvented because you want them on your side because of their potency if you are seeking to prosecute a particular cause. In the 19th century, Wallace was very much, bizarrely, an icon of union. But in more recent times, he has been reclaimed, we might say, as an icon of Scottish independence, which I think one could safely say would resonate more closely with the historical Wallace. In terms of factuality, again, we have this clutch, this very small pool of real evidence to help us with Wallace. His birthplace is disputed, but we're talking about southern Scotland in the west. Something we can say with confidence is that the Wallaces themselves, there is this idea that Wallace comes from the very grassroots of Scottish society, almost a kind of outlaw figure from the first, and that is not the case. He and his family were part of the retinue of a bigger family or kindred or clan, the Stuarts, who are again these imports from the continent in the 12th and 13th century. So the Wallaces have their place, their established place in Scottish society, and they're a landowning family in their own right. Wallace is no man from nowhere. But something that's always been interesting to historians is the fact that because of the fact that they're landowning, you might have expected William Wallace to be there in that ragman role, recording all of these oaths of fealty given by the Scottish landowning classes to Edward at Berwick in August 1296, and Wallace is not there. His name is not there. And that, I think, is consistent with everything else we know about William Wallace, who never at any point in his short life does homage to Edward I, although he was accused of treason against his supposed overlord when it comes to his death. In 1297, we get two risings, and Wallace leads one of them in the south of Scotland. But it's important to remember from the start that he's not acting in isolation. There is a rising in the north, and that's led by somebody of higher social status, Sir Andrew Murray. And it's a notable feature of Wallace's career in 1297 that whenever he makes a move, he's accompanied by somebody of higher status. Another noble is acting with him. When he kills William of Hazelrigg, the Sheriff of Lanark, in May 1297, which kind of really kicks off the revolt in general, he's accompanied by Sir Richard Lundy, for example. And these two men come together, Wallace and Murray, near Stirling in September of 1297, and they await the English army which comes against them, and famously they win the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which Mel Gibson managed to elide out of the movie. But the bridge was crucial to the tactics the Scots employed in winning this battle. And this was an extraordinary achievement. We're talking about a very powerful English army, and the Scottish army is largely composed of the lower levels of Scottish society. The middling classes really dominate. Now, that's not because the Scottish aristocracy were totally lukewarm and not positively disposed to what Wallace and Murray, etc., were doing. You have to remember that many of that Scottish ruling class had been captured at the Battle of Dunbar in 1296. There was a vacuum of power at the top. What is really astonishing is that somebody of Wallace's social status steps into that vacuum and is able to heal it, and that people follow him. Scots turn out for Wallace in 1297. That is the crucial thing, I think. And they volunteer. We know that there's large-scale volunteering going on for Wallace. Now, part of this is discontent with the English regime and its heavy-handedness, so the English create problems for themselves there, but part of this must come down to the Wallace factor itself and his ability to inspire. So in later 1297, Murray, I should say, is fatally wounded at the Battle of Stirling Bridge and so drops out of the scene, and that leaves Wallace on his own as sole guardian of Scotland, and he's knighted in 1297 and leads Scotland for a brief, extraordinary period as the chief secular individual within the kingdom. But he's defeated at Falkirk the following year, and that really spells the end of Wallace's career. He had come forward as a military champion, and when he loses that battle, that status goes, and he ceases to be guardian after 1298. But he doesn't relinquish loyalty to the cause. This is the remarkable thing. Again, it's that dedication, that integrity, devotion to the cause of independence that comes across. He goes on diplomatic missions to France and to Rome in subsequent years, and never comes in to Edward's peace, and ultimately it takes is captured by a compatriot. That's what leads to his execution in 1305. And it's now that Bruce, the grandson of the competitor of 1291, 1292, the great cause, steps forward. And again, with Bruce, our sources let us down in terms of having any real sense of what this man looked like. Our written evidence tells us nothing about that. There's the seal, the great seal from his reign on the left there. So there's the King of Scots in his battle mode, but we're not going to get any sense of what Bruce looked like from that. In the middle is a facial reconstruction, and I'll come back to this, which probably gives us our best chance of getting closer to the historical Bruce and his appearance. I'll explain a bit more about that at the very end. Robert Bruce makes his move in 1306. Wallace is dead now. Edward has reconquered Scotland, and it looks for all the world as if there is nothing now which can resurrect this kingdom, save it from a state of perpetual vassaldom to Edward I's England. But Robert Bruce, the grandson, has never forgotten the fact that he has a valid claim to the throne. And on the 10th of February 1306, he meets John Comyn, the head of that other great powerful kindred within the kingdom, at the Greyfriars Kirk Church in Dumfries in southwest Scotland. Now, this is one of the pivotal moments in medieval Scottish history, and it's what happens in that church on that day resonates for centuries. It is one of these genuine turning points in history. We have rival accounts, varied accounts of what happened. How would we know, who is going to pass this information down? What we do know is the outcome, that John Comyn is left dying before the altar of this church, and Robert Bruce is implicated in his death. Had Bruce sought common support in Bruce's making a bid for the throne? That might be a reasonable explanation. If so, everything went wrong. And Robert Bruce, at the outset of his own career as King of Scots, starts in the worst possible mode. He has killed or been implicated in the killing of another human being on sacred ground, and he is excommunicated by the Pope because of that. Nonetheless, he proceeds to Scone and is inaugurated as king there at the end of March. And of course, Edward comes after him, and the English forces in Scotland come after him, and the Bruce of 1306 is not a very competent military leader at all, and ultimately has to flee the kingdom in the mainland of Scotland come that autumn. And you'll be familiar, many of you I'm sure, with the legend of Bruce and the spider, seeing the spider trying to make its way from one side of the cave to the other, try again. And there's no doubt that in the years that we're now turning to, Bruce's indefatigability, his determination, maybe this is something that unites him with Wallace, is a key quality that sees him through many difficult situations and results in ultimate success. Bruce returns to the mainland of Scotland in early 1307. The problem, of course, that he faces is not only that he has a hostile England against him, he doesn't just have to fight a national war, he has to fight a civil war against Scottish opponents, that common faction, and many others who regard Bruce not as the rightful King of Scots, but as a usurper, because, I forgot to mention this a minute ago, but it's critical here, the Scots still have a king, John Balliol, who in the wake of 1296 had ended up on the continent in exile, but he is still alive. The throne for many Scots is not unoccupied when Bruce makes his bid for that throne. So we effectively have a civil war taking place now, the civil war that never happened back in 1291. And Bruce's various opponents that he has to take on. And astonishingly in these years, bit by bit, Bruce does. And he does so, there are various factors we could talk about which result in Bruce's success, but the inability of his enemies to unite against him, the fact that they allow Bruce to come against them and to pick them off one by one, is critical. The Pass of Brander here in Argyll, we think that this is the scene of an important battle which Bruce wins in the autumn of 1308. That's his Argyll campaign. But already before then, he's gone into the heart of common country in northeast Scotland, the earldom of Buchan, and he's defeated his opponents there. And his brother has also conquered Galloway, the very southwest of Scotland, in the summer of 1308. So in the space of a couple of years, Bruce is able to turn the tide in the Civil War, and that enables him then to turn his attention to the National War and to give serious attention to the business of unpicking that English hold over Scotland, which is expressed particularly in castles, major castles of Scotland across the kingdom that the English held, and having garrisons there and military forces concentrated there enabled them to dominate the territory round about and to act as a colonial regime. One by one, these castles fall to Bruce and his forces, some by siege, some by more imaginative stratagems. And all of this is helped by the fact that Edward I had died in 1307, and Edward II, his son, proves to be largely uninterested in Scotland in these years, and again gives Bruce the latitude to just go about his business, winning over hearts and minds in Scotland, as well as the infrastructure and territory of the kingdom. Ultimately, in October 1313, Bruce issues an ultimatum to his remaining Scottish opponents. He says, "It is time for you to come over into my peace. If you do not do so, at the end of in the course of the following year, i.e. down to October 1314, you will be forfeited. You will lose your lands." So it's an ultimatum, and by this stage we have very few castles left in the possession of the English in Scotland. Edinburgh and Roxburgh and Stirling are the big three, and the Scots take Edinburgh and Roxburgh. In early 1314, it's only Stirling now, the most important single castle in Scotland. And Edward II realises that there is no option now but to raise an army and to bring it into Scotland against Bruce. And that brings us to the most famous battle in Scottish history, of course, in June of 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn. And Bruce, who has spent years avoiding this scenario of taking on a big English army in the field, he's been fighting effectively guerrilla warfare for a number of years now. He takes on that English army, and over the course of 2 days, he defeats it. An astonishing victory. So that's 1314, but it takes 14 more years for peace to be made, a peace treaty to be made, and for Bruce to achieve his two key aims: recognition of the legitimacy of his own kingship and recognition of the independence of his kingdom. And in terms of the various things that happened between 1314 and 1328 to enable these goals to be achieved, Arbroath, the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, stands out, and I'm going to finish by just offering a few thoughts on it. The Pope, as I said, is instinctively and immediately against Bruce in 1316, so that's another battle that Bruce has got to win, but he has to win that battle by different means. And the letter that the nobility of Scotland send the Pope in 1320 is all about this. What do they say in that letter? They say that the Scots as a people have only ever known freedom. They say that the popes, from time immemorial, have supported the Scots in that they have supported that cause of Scottish freedom. So that's a pointed memo, if you like, to the Pope who's receiving this letter, John the 22nd. They say that the Scots had fought off all comers in order to create their freedom and to maintain their freedom, and the English were the latest in a line of peoples who had sought to take that freedom from them but had failed. Freedom, in other words, is the kind of ordering principle of the document. Let me come to two perhaps most famous sections of the text. And you'll see that this is where I got my title for my talk today, For Freedom Alone. And this is the climax of the oratory of the Declaration of Arbroath. It's a splendid piece of Latin rhetoric. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we in any conditions be subjected to the lordship of the English. This is them writing to the Pope, remember, trying to make their case, trying to make the Pope understand why it is that they will refuse to lay down their arms until the English have agreed to a peace treaty. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, libertas in the Latin, of course, for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. So a remarkable medieval declaration of the allegiance to the principle of freedom. There are various human parties in this document. We'll come to Bruce in a second, who are mentioned. The Pope is also popes and the Pope are mentioned as well. But this is a document which is about not people, but about an idea. It is freedom which sits at the hierarchy of the document, if you like, and everybody who is mentioned within the document is subordinated to that principle. And that includes the King of Scots. It includes Robert Bruce himself. There is a section of the letter which praises Bruce and his achievements in restoring that historic freedom to the Kingdom of Scotland. But what do the Scots say then? They don't continue in that mode of prose. They continue with these astonishing words. If he should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or to the English, we would strive at once to drive him out, Bruce, their liberator, as our enemy. Our enemy, notice that. The big enemy of the Scots in Arbroath is not Edward I or the English, it is their own king, and a subverter of his own right and ours, and we would make some other man who is able to defend us our king. In other words, it is that principle of freedom that comes first, and the identity of the king, in a sense, is subordinate to that. You know, what matters about the king, what makes a King of Scots a king, is dedication to the cause of freedom, particularly in the context of relations with England. Now think about this. Think about the fact that, as I've said already, John Balliol had accepted the poisoned chalice of a subordinate kingship, had done homage to Edward I back in 1292 and being made King of Scots. Now, if you don't think about these words here on the slide in relation to Bruce, but if you think about them as applying to John Balliol, you see immediately, in a sense, that what the text is doing, I think, is not so much deposing or suggesting that Bruce might be deposed, because Bruce has freed the kingdom. He's satisfied this criterion in some style. But what this clause actually does, I think, is justify the deposition of John Balliol in 1306 when Robert Bruce took the throne. Now, Balliol was dead by now, 1314, same year as Bannockburn, but Balliol's son, Edward Balliol, was alive. And where was he in 1320? He was at the court of Edward II. Again, we have that idea, I think, being captured in the language of the Declaration of Arbroath. A Balliol kingship, whether it's John Balliol the father or Edward Balliol the son, is unacceptable, because what a King of Scots should be is protect that kingdom from the King of England and the English, as opposed to giving way to them. So a truly remarkable document, I think. And we have a medieval text there, really, presenting that idea of the responsibility of the ruler to the ruled, and the responsibility of the King of Scots to honour that principle of freedom, and if they fail, they should be deposed. Now, the final treaty comes in 1328. Bruce finally manages to bring the English regime to the negotiating table. This is not Edward II, who's died the previous year, but Edward III, who's young and vulnerable. So Bruce presses home his advantage, and he gets recognition of Scottish independence and of the legitimacy of his own kingship. So we have Bruce late in life, the man is very ill by now, achieving these key goals. Just to finish very quickly with some words on Bruce, and this takes us into the realm of material culture. You see these fragments that we have all that are left of the once noble tomb of Robert Bruce. He dies in 1329 and was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. But specialists from the National Museums of Scotland, working alongside curators at the Hunterian University Museum in Glasgow, using those poor fragments, have managed to recreate what we think Bruce's tomb would have looked like when buried at Dunfermline. And make no mistake, this was Bruce in death, making the sort of statement that he had made throughout his reign. This is all about the status of the Scottish kingdom as on a par with any other independent kingdom within Latin Christendom. This is the same style of tomb as was used to bury the French medieval royal line, and we know that the tomb was made of Italian marble and then made up at a workshop in Paris. And coming back finally, just quickly to Bruce, we have this skull which came from what we believe to be the tomb of Bruce when it was excavated at Dunfermline in 1818 and 1819, and using the latest techniques, craniofacial specialists have been able to come up with this reconstruction of what Robert Bruce may have looked like. So just to finish quickly there, Bruce dying in 1329, the war did not end. The Second War of Independence broke out not long afterwards, so we cannot say that the peace that Robert brought to Scotland in his latter years was a lasting peace. But I think that Robert's achievement nonetheless, and we have to, I think, here bring Wallace on board as well, put the two men side by side as opposed to seeing them as in any sense the antithesis of each other or antagonistic. What to my mind unites them is their dedication to the same cause, and they fight that in different ways according to their character and to their social status and the circumstances they find themselves in. But I think both men and this period contribute. They didn't make Scotland an independent kingdom. As I said at the start, it was already a kingdom, and that mature status was critical in ensuring its survival through these very, very testing decades. But I think that we see evolution in this period, and I think that what Arbroath in particular suggests is that we're moving beyond a kingdom, beyond the idea of the king as the be-all and end-all, because of that idea of, well, if a king fails us, then we will need to get another one who's going to maintain the more important principle of the freedom of the kingdom. That's the stage at which you perhaps begin to think that a kingdom is transforming itself, or potentially transforming itself into something more than a kingdom, into a nation would be perhaps the natural word we would turn to in that situation. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've not gone on for too long, but many thanks everyone for listening, and be happy to try and answer any questions if anyone's got those. I'll just stop the screen share just now.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. MacGregor. That was wonderful, wonderful. It was clarifying, and I am completely inspired by this. So on that note, I would like to again repeat Dr. MacGregor and open the floor for questions and discussion, please. Please unmute your mics and turn your cameras on, and I will begin trying to help you do that. Thank you. And while people are becoming organized, Dr. MacGregor, could you just remind us who was the author of the biography of Robert Bruce that you mentioned as the preeminent one, because I didn't catch it?
Yes, I mean it's a book still in print, and although it was written in 1965, but it's very, very fresh to read, and it was actually the book that got me interested in Scottish history. I read it when I was still at school, and it's had a lasting effect on me, and I was very lucky when I started at Edinburgh University that the author actually had just moved to Edinburgh University as Professor of Scottish History, moved from St Andrews the same year I started. The name is G.W.S. Barrow, Barrow, Geoffrey Wallace Stewart, but GWS is how he always appears in print. And his book is called Robert Bruce and the Community of the Realm of Scotland. And that reflected his belief that he couldn't tell a conventional biography. He had to tell the story of this idea, as he saw it, the community of the realm of Scotland. This idea of, he thought that this was as close as a medieval nation could come to expressing the idea of nationhood in words, and it was the relationship of Bruce and the community, which he sought to explore in the book. But it's a wonderful piece of historical writing, and I think the thing I really like about it is that it's so readable. It's a very literary work. And you don't get bogged down at all. It's an antithesis of kind of dull history. It's anything but, and very insightful. And that's a long time ago that was written now, since 1965. But to my mind, it's still the best place to go to learn about Bruce. And I happen to share Barrow's view of Bruce, which is a particularly rosy one. I would say he regards him as an outstanding monarch and leader, and there's things that we could pick away at there for sure, but I would share in that general judgment. But it's a great book. I would really recommend it.
And Professor John Cameron has this hand up, but before you comment or ask a question, there is a movement underway today to rewrite history, and I think in many cases to discredit Scottish history. And so I tend to always go back to the older texts. But John, what do you have to say, sir?
Yeah, well, I was interested on one of the points of your slide about the legacy of the Declaration of Arbroath and its relationship to our Declaration of Independence. And clearly the concept that, the polity has power over the head of state or the monarch is a similar parallel with our independence. And of course, this is our 250th anniversary, so there's been a lot of writing and scholarship and debate about our founding fathers and their concept of nationhood, but also of equality and independence. So wondering if you could comment on that. And also, you start with you frame this around the concept of freedom, but really from what the text of the Declaration of Arbroath indicates, it's really about independence. And of course, that too is critical to our Declaration of Independence. So there's another through line there, but it's really not about freedom in the Enlightenment concept of individual liberty, which of course is a key component of our Declaration of Independence as well. So just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, many thanks, John, for really interesting questions. And I must say, I find the constitutional aspects of this First War of Independence particularly interesting. And the Scots were in this, placed in difficult waters. They showed constitutional maturity in the first place in terms of how they navigated the situation in the wake of the death of Alexander III. But things then get worse when his granddaughter dies. But the concept of guardianship, I think, is an interesting one. That I didn't make too much of that, although I did mention it. But there we have the idea of a kind of a council coming in and running the kingdom in the absence of the monarch. And you'll have noticed that Wallace is appointed guardian in the wake of the Battle of Stirling Bridge and the death of Murray, so he is occupying that place as well. And if you look at the document, the very few documents that we have issued by William Wallace, charters, etc., what Wallace says is that he is acting in the name of the community of the realm of Scotland. That's one of the instances, the context in which that phrase crops up, and Barrow sees very great significance in this, that this is where Wallace is deriving his authority from. But he also says that he's fighting in the name of King John. And it's really important to acknowledge that, and that rather fell away perhaps in that part of my presentation, that although King John is forced to abdicate by Edward in 1296, the Scots, for the first part of the war, their game plan is to get John back, that they regard that deposition as unlawful and that John is the rightful king. So Wallace, if you like, is constitutionally quite conservative. He's not trying to seize power. It's not like a coup d'etat from William Wallace. He's trying to tap into clearly these acknowledged sources of authority, not only the king who's in exile over the water, but this concept of the community of the realm. And when the Scots send that letter to the Pope in 1320, they say again that this is coming to him from the nobility of Scotland and the community of the realm as well. So that phrase is used there. I think that it's very interesting what you say about freedom and its application in collective and individual senses. That slide I showed, where the kind of apotheosis of the rhetoric of the declaration. It's interesting that they do turn there to a statement which is individualizing freedom. They say that they're fighting for freedom, that which no man, as they say in the lingo of the time, gives up, but with life itself. So you've got that idea of freedom at the individual level, that you would not sacrifice that as long as you are able to draw breath. But at the same time, in the earlier parts of the text, what they have sought to argue is that the Scots have been a people who have been free from the first. They have only ever known freedom. And that from the point at which they set off on their travels from Scythia, ultimately reaching Scotland, they fought off all comers, as I said. I think there's considerable sophistication, complexity in their conception of freedom, and their dedication to it is demonstrated by the fact that, as far as they are concerned, this is why a King of Scots exists, is in order to maintain the freedom of the collective. So as you say, this is why the constitutional theorists get interested, I think, in it and draw that line between 1320 and 1776, the idea that power needs to be answerable to the collective, to the people. It's the idea of the social contract, or contractual, a contractual political relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And for this to come out of a society in which we would conventionally think of this as the era of absolute monarchy, where power is actually conferred upon a monarch by God, and that gives him unlimited authority over his subjects. This is quite a turn up for the books. It's not as if medieval society was bereft of such ideas. There were contingencies in place that philosophers talk about for a people in a situation where they find themselves under a tyranny. That deposition could kick in there. But the Scottish scenario is different. It's the fact that freedom is their defining principle. That's what they make their stand on. That's the issue upon which authority has to do its stuff. And if it doesn't, then it can be deposed. So thanks for the question. And it's quite a controversial issue as to whether one can actually connect, the 1320 and 1770s. Is there a line that one can follow, a genealogy of texts which would take you from one to the other? But there are those scholars who've sought to argue that. We know, of course, there's strong Scottish influence, at that stage in American society, and we have Scottish signatories, don't we, to the Declaration of Independence.
Stacey, do you have a question?
I do, and thank you, Dr. MacGregor, for so much background and information. I'm sure you could go on, and I would love to sit in one of your classrooms and just pummel you with questions. I think it would be very fun. But my question today, my last name, Strawn, is a derivative of Strawn, but from the village of Strawn, south of Aberdeen, which is spelled Strachan, in merry old Scotland. So the question I have for you is, the Strawn clan was related to the Commons. Ouch, right? And so, we were all annihilated. We were all displaced. We were all sent off as servants. And as I have done homework and gone back to that village of Strawn, there is still, surprisingly, a sentiment that if you're not related to or tied to Robert the Bruce, you are still peanuts. You're nothing. You're very little. So the hierarchy, or you could say the caste system that is in England is still very active. Of course, there's a caste system here in the US as well, but of sorts. But what happened to all those people? And do we know not just the Straughns, but all the common clans and the other contenders for the throne? What happened to all of them? And how many were there? Were there millions? Were there, maybe not millions, but back in the day, they didn't have that many of the population. But how many people were actually displaced? As you mentioned, Robert the Bruce picked them off one by one. What kind of volume are we talking about, do you think, Doctor?
Yes, thanks very much for that. And yeah, there's a few things to say there. And I think one of them is to be, we should be careful when we think about the Commons. They end up on the losing side, I suppose you could say that. They make their stand against Bruce, and that can lead to the impression, therefore, because of what Bruce goes on to achieve, that the Commons are kind of, in the baddies camp of history and are somehow anti-Scottish, if you like, and that would be a gross misrepresentation of the situation, because from 1296 down to 1306, the first, that decade, really before Bruce makes his move, the Commons are at the heart of resistance to Edward I. They are, as I said, the most powerful kindred in Scotland, and leading members of that kindred are acting as guardians of Scotland. The man that Bruce kills there in 1306, John Comyn himself, he's been a guardian. He and Bruce actually had served as guardians side by side at one stage. The Scots trying to, override the political differences in the name of national unity. So I think we have to acknowledge that the Commons, played a very, very distinguished part in the patriotic struggle in the first part of the war, and that obviously with the head of their kindred having been killed by Bruce in 1306, and with Balliol still over the water and somebody who was related to them, and in their eyes and in the eyes of many Scots, still legitimate king. It's important, I think, to give the Commons their due. Now, to give Bruce his due in turn, I mean, when it comes to Bruce's settlement of Scotland, once he's carried out forfeitures on those who refuse to come into his peace, Bruce is in a powerful position. He's able to redraw the map of political power, regional political power in Scotland, and that has a very lasting effect on Scottish history, actually. But one thing that Barrow, the author of that book, is strong on, I think, is he sees Bruce as a very magnanimous figure. That his approach to kingship is very different to Edward I's, perhaps a different type of personality, and that Bruce is at pains. He recognises the divisions in the political community, and he sees his job ultimately, once he's won the Civil War, as not so much in grinding his opponents into the dust as trying to heal the rifts in Scottish society. So he doesn't really go after the Commons. I mean, big common structures are certainly dismantled. One can understand why Bruce feels the need to do that. But further down the social scale, there's strong evidence that Bruce is not interested in pursuing a singular vendetta against the Commons and everybody connected to the Commons. Now, in terms, I think the other thing that you were interested in was maybe just a sense of numbers, and in terms of the kind of conflicts that are going on, how many people might be involved here. I mean, Bruce himself, he starts off with a tiny force, and I think when he first crosses the Forth heading north in 1306, he's got 64 men at arms with him. That's the kind of size of army that Robert Bruce starts off with. By the time of Bannockburn, we're talking about a few thousand. Edward II comes up with a massive army, maybe 15,000 or so, something like that. So these are the kind of, the English obviously could put out bigger armies than the Scots could, but that would be your kind of the kind of numbers you'd be thinking of in terms of the big scale battles of the period, and then proportionately fewer numbers than that. But I don't think that Bruce is interested in trying to level areas of Scotland and to wipe out the population. That's not the kind of approach to power that Robert Bruce takes. There's a lot of continuity in the settlement that he brings to the country, certainly at the level of the earls. And there's a lot of evidence. Bruce is somebody who waits to the last minute, gives people the chance to come over and declare their loyalty to him. That's very much a trait I would see in terms of his personality. One of the strong points of his personality.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good to hear. So you know how stories get passed on, and they add color the longer they get passed down. So thank you for that feedback.
Not at
I appreciate it.
More comments, more questions?
I think there's a hand raised there. Concerts at Lockhart.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're muted. We see a hand up on Lockhart. If you wish to say something, you're currently muted. I don't know whether I can unmute you or not.
There we go.
Oh, good. Fabulous.
Are you able to, am I able to be
We
seen?
can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mrs. Lockhart. I actually, I am an African American, Native American, and Scottish historian from North Carolina. I married someone whose grandfather came from Glasgow. And so during the pandemic, when I had to teach my own children, to be safe, we took our kids throughout the state of North Carolina, which of course is a Scottish territory, North and South Carolina. I guess my question kind of is, as a family genealogist, but just a historian in general, is when you have groups of people, particularly in North Carolina, there is a group called the Lumbee Natives, who acknowledge their African American, Native American, and Scottish ancestries. And I guess my question is, how do you feel the clan system within the Scottish Society, or the Highland and Lowland Scots, played a role with, I guess, the territories of certain states during the 1700s and 1800s, as people started to intermingle and intermarry with other ethnicities? Did the clan and territory system that occurred in Ireland and Scotland, did it affect the way that at least Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina particularly was formed? That was a question I know my kids actually asked, was like, why is North Carolina particularly such like a huge Scottish pride? There's a lot of pride in North Carolina. And for me, I'm tricultural, and my father was very proud of his Scottish ancestry from Mississippi. And so having a Scottish last name, but sadly for me, I've only been able to get to 1830. I haven't even found whom the name came from. We were just farmers. So that's my question, I guess. How did the clan system, once it came to the United States, dictate how certain states and counties were formed within the U.S.?
Thanks a lot for the question. And I think when I was with you last year, I talked a bit about the clans actually, and clan society. I don't know if that talk's still out there. I know that you do record your talk, so it might.
It's YouTube channel for Chicago Scots. Yes, it is.
it might be worth having a listen to what I said last year. Just if you're interested in clan society and in general, there might be some use there. But tying it into what I was talking about today, I was, you might have noticed at various points I was referring to people like the Bruces and the Commons as. It's always tricky with the lingo, isn't it? What you say? Do we call them families or kindreds or clans? I've got no problem in using the term clan. Sometimes I think people are historians. I mean, professional historians are a bit wary about it. They regard it as perhaps too populist a term, but it's a legitimate term to use because it's there in our sources. And I think I suppose the basic point to make here is really that kinship mattered profoundly in Scottish society, and one can trace this, I guess, I would say anyway, to the Gaelic component of Scottish society, that this was very much a kin-based way of operating, so that you do get these entities which are socio-political entities that we most commonly call clans. Now, I talked about the New Scots of the 12th and 13th centuries, people who were coming into Scotland from the continent, and I mentioned the fact that the Bruces originate. They come from Bree, and we've got the Baliol's coming in from Picardy. The Stuarts I mentioned in the passing. The Wallaces being retainers or followers of the Stuarts, and the Stuarts, of course, go on to occupy the kingship for centuries, but their origins are French as well. The interesting thing about all of these people when they come across is how they get absorbed into this kind of kin-based framework which already exists, and how they become naturalised within that. So it becomes, I think, a defining principle of Scottish history, and it's something that spans lowlands and highlands. We're used to this distinction, but I think one thing that is a universal is the role of kinship. So that, as you were saying there, gets exported obviously as we get Scots moving across, and I'm not such a specialist on the diaspora and how kinship plays out there, but one can understand, and one sees this in particular phases of Scottish emigration in the later 18th century, perhaps particularly, where you get kin groups who are essentially travelling across, and the aim is to seek to found settlements together, so that kin principle survives. I mean, a very good place where you observe this is Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, where you get a lot of that happening. But it happens in what becomes the US as well. I think going back to your point about how it might relate to kind of particular regions or counties or states even, what one phenomenon one sees is where you've got Highlanders in military service on behalf of Britain in the 18th century. Georgia is a good case in point, that you get people being settled, soldiers being settled. And in that case, it was Macintoshes, I think, in particular, as a means of defining boundaries, political boundaries. So that's a case where kind of kinship and the political mosaic certainly do come together.
MacGregor, if you don't mind, may I call on Catherine Fort? She's from North Carolina, and she's had her hand up. And Catherine, please forgive me.
Oh, that's okay. I just was going to say that that we in the Scottish Society of Wilmington, and I think Don McLeod's gone, but also the St. Andrews Society of North Carolina, are committed to being open to all people of Scottish descent. Well, the Scottish Society, the St. Andrews Society, only if you're a man, but that's something that's really important to me particularly, and to, I think, our group. We just dedicated a memorial to the somewhere around 30,000 Scots who emigrated to the Cape Fear region, and the woman from the state who made the keynote address is, in fact, Native, Black, and Scottish, and she talked about that, and she did a really great job of incorporating it all into that ceremony and making it open to everyone.
And
Yeah,
if you don't, I'm sorry.
I'm also working with Jamie Oxendine a
okay.
lot these days. Yeah.
Right. And see,
I
that's
sorry.
been an issue for me as a historian, where I am culturally Cherokee, African American, and Choctaw, and Scottish or Scots Irish German. We were military, so we're from Fort Bragg. That's what brought us to North Carolina, and so we acknowledged, we knew that the last name, of course, was Scottish. We have our, our kilts, and yes, I've gone to Wilmington as well, or the main one outside of Pinehurst. We've gone to the Scottish games, which were huge, but I it's it's interesting because living in North Carolina predominantly of my childhood, there was always the issue of native territory ownership. I know what Mr. MacGregor was just speaking about, uh, and Ms. Fort probably would understand this more, how uh, at certain time periods, of course, within the state's history, ownership of farms or land came into question, due sadly because of race. And so sometimes, especially in the Lumbee tribe, particularly, they would go ahead and put their deed or home sometimes in the Scottish ancestor's name, so there would be no hiccup, if you could say, of ownership of, oh, okay, you're black, well, then there are provisions, or you're Native American, well, you can't own land, you don't believe in it. Or and in my case, my grandmother is part Asian. I know in Mississippi, you couldn't own a house, which is why you could own a store, and they slept in the back of their store, or they would put the house in a white or black relative's name as the deed holder, and then they would run it. And so I just know, particularly for North Carolina, as she just said, Oxidine, Locklear, they're quite a huge group. But I just remember growing up that particularly they pride themselves on their Scottish ancestry. And you can see it throughout Pembroke and Lumberton and surrounding areas, because they had to fight, with the British, their rights for, as you said, kinship, but just, I guess, just territory, particularly. And that was how I was at least taught as a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, was that was the way you, one, knew your family, but two, how it was kept. And I just always wondered, was that something that came from overseas, or was that something that developed, over, a few hundred years? But thank you, Ms. Ward. I thank you for, letting me know. But yeah, my husband's a part of the Wilmington Society as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah, if I may, Mrs. Lockhart, I'd like you to enter, if you wouldn't object, your email or your contact information in the chat, because I'd very much like to reach out to you there. Donald McLeod knows an awful lot about the Lumbee Indians. He's interfaced with that community in North Carolina for years, and I think a number of us would love to interface with you. I was raised in North Carolina, and I know that the Ulster Scots from Northern Ireland came over in around the 1730s, trying to get away from the animosity that had been created there by virtue of the British Crown taking land and giving it to Ulster Scots and British citizens that had been taken from the Irish Catholics. And so they were eager to leave and sail for America. And many of them came to North Carolina, some of them through New Jersey and down the Great Wagon Road. But in the close to the American Revolutionary War, around 1775, the governor of North Carolina advertised to the Scots, and particularly Scottish Highlanders, and those who were able to find means sailed for America and went directly to North Carolina. and then there were a host of others who had been either voluntarily or otherwise had joined the British Crown almost as mercenaries to fight English wars. I meant to say English, not British. And so there were a number of English soldiers in North Carolina. So I, having been raised there, my understanding was in the 1700s, the state was roughly 50% Scottish and 50% German, but there was also a huge population, I'm sorry to say and greatly regret, of slaves in North Carolina, and of course the indigenous American Indian population. And many Scots were pioneers, such as Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and so forth, and many Scots who had landed in North Carolina, who had no prejudices, married free slaves, married African Americans openly, and there is a lot of mixed blood. We're very proud of it. I'm now part of Anderson clan by marriage and have always been I'm of Scottish ancestry. But I just posted on Facebook 7 Andersons who are African American, who were great achievers in America over the decades, and who we're so very proud of. So we'd love to interface with you. I'm going to stop there. I was just probably overly zealous, but I'm delighted you're on, and please, we'll hope to see you every month. And please bring friends, family, and so forth. Jim Plaxco, you've had your hand up for quite a while. I am sorry to have jumped in before.
That is not a problem because I enjoyed listening to what you had to say. So thank you for that. I was just curious, earlier on in the talk, you had made reference to a book from the 60s. And it occurred to me that occasionally there are documentary finds that give us new insights into history. And I'm just wondering if there have been any similar discoveries over the last 20 years with respect to the period of time you've been speaking of in your talk today.
It's a really good question, Jim, and it is kind of extraordinary. You'd have thought that we're talking about a reasonably remote period of history, and you'd have thought that everything that exists, everything that survives, would be known and would be out there and had already been discussed. But it's remarkable that things do keep cropping up, and usually this is due to the just indefatigable efforts of sometimes amateur historians who just dig away and come across things. So a find made not all that long ago in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow concerned Wallace, actually. I mean, we've got so little hard historical information about him, but I think it was actually in one of my slides was the seal of Wallace's father. So that was a relatively recent and very exciting find. I mean, it seems to have the figure of a bowman on that seal, and it's evidence that perhaps points us more towards an Ayrshire than a Renfrewshire origin for the Wallaces. I mentioned too this, and it seems a very arcane point about how many guardians were appointed by the Scots in 1286 when their king died. But it's a chronicle that's only come to light in very recent years, which was owned by a private collector in Norway, actually, which gives the data, the extra data, that there may have been a 7th guardian, the Bishop of Dunkeld, who died kind of early on in the war, and perhaps therefore was lost sight of in other sources. But perhaps of most interest in terms of
this is the thing. The professor from Scotland.
In terms of the line I took, talking about Wallace quite a bit there, is information relating to the death of Wallace in 1305. Now, this is a highly emotive topic, but he was captured I'll just try and be brief here. But I mean, it gives insights, I think, into Edward I in particular. Wallace was captured on the 5th of August, 1305, and he wasn't executed in Scotland. He was taken all the way to London, to Smithfield actually, and executed there on the 23rd of August. Now the date is significant. We have to translate that into medieval terms. This was the eve of St. Bartholomew's Fair, and that was 2 days of celebration in the capital of England. And this was the largest fair in medieval England, and indeed in early modern England. So Wallace's execution effectively began the celebrations of St. Bartholomew's Fair in that particular year. But we also learned that Wallace's place of execution outside the church, the priory church of St. Great.
Make pancakes.
Someone, is that?
Yeah, someone's needs to
Honey,
mute
can you
the
mute
microphone.
Lockhart?
Is it look?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The place of execution was outside the priory church of St. Bartholomew the Great, and this was right beside Smithfield in the city of London. And St. Bartholomew was the patron saint of butchers, and Smithfield, as some of you may know, was for a long time a very famous meat market. But Bartholomew is also the patron saint of tanners, and achieved his martyrdom by being flayed to death. So all of this sounds rather gruesome. Now the point here is this: I talked about the English the regime that Edward I established in Scotland in 1296, and a key figure in that regime was his treasurer Hugh Cressingham, and Cressingham was hated by the Scots because of his implementation of taxation in a kind of English style. And in the wake of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace, we're told in the chronicles, actually had Cressingham flayed, the skin taken from that man's body and cut into strips, and Wallace used it to make a baldric, a sword belt, which he would have worn across his chest on a diagonal. So I think if you put two and two together here, I think the fact that Wallace was executed where he was, outside the church dedicated to St. Bartholomew, patron saint of tanners, I think this was Edward I making a very, very pointed looking in the direction of what Wallace had done in 1297 in terms of the way in which Wallace then, it was a case of poetic justice being meted out to Wallace, that Wallace was suffering a fate just outside this church dedicated to the tanners. So sources like that can crop up and can really give you pause for thought. But I mean, just to quickly end on your point there, Jim, the one thing to say about the sources in general for the war is that the Scottish sources are thin. The English sources are much better, and I think part of that is because the English are running an administration in Scotland. For much of this period, Scotland is in disarray. The early years of Bruce's reign are very, very poorly documented because he's out there in the field fighting on a pretty much constant basis. But also Edward I took a lot of records away, and some of these never made it back to Scotland. Some of them never made it south of the border, actually. They went away by ship, and a ship went down in the Firth of Forth full of early Scottish records, which is a tremendous loss to the National Archive. But it is really interesting that we're still getting the odd document turning up and enabling us to make connections of the sort that gives us insights into the psychology of somebody like Edward I. And he clearly had a fixation upon Wallace. The stance that Wallace took and his refusal to do homage to him was something that clearly rankled.
Wow, thank you. That was fascinating.
Marie, are you the granddaughter of the Kerrs? You're muted.
Hi.
Is that you?
No.
Oh, I thought I recognized you. Please proceed with your comment or question.
Oh, I didn't have one. Sorry. Did I have my hand up?
Yes, thank you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know how I did that. I apologize.
Okay, other discussion points. David, are you trying to? No? Okay. Any other
I
thoughts?
guess I have one kind of question. You touched on the fact that Wallace was a supporter of the Common faction. How divisive was that between, I mean, people have made out in popular culture, okay, Mel Gibson, that Bruce was, almost actively opposed to Wallace. How much truth do you think there is to that?
I don't think there's truth in that at all, actually.
Okay. That fits in with Mel Gibson's the rest of the movie then.
I think it may be one of the things that Mel got right in a kind of roundabout way, perhaps. No, I think I should perhaps have made this clearer, but if we're trying to fit the Wallaces into medieval Scottish society, they are most strongly connected to the Stuarts, who are bigger guns. They're at baronial level by this point in time. And the Wallaces are followers of theirs. Now that directs you towards southwest Scotland, and the Stuarts and the Bruces are intimately linked as well. They're very much on the same page. So we can fit Wallace quite snugly into that scene. And an overarching figure who's relevant here too, I didn't mention the church too much, although it's very important in the story, but an unsung hero of the War of Independence. You don't hear much about this man in comparison to Wallace or Bruce, but was Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow. Now, he did homage to Edward I a lot of times, and he clearly didn't lose any sleep over it, but he was a critical figure in mobilising Scottish resistance in the first half of the war in particular. And you can connect both Wallace and Robert Bruce quite closely to Wishart. He was essentially a mentor figure to both, and probably a confessor to both as well. So that's one of the bits of evidence that allows you to kind of see an alignment, a natural alignment between Wallace and Bruce. So I think that's very much how this, that's the kind of way I would read things. And that's not to say that, I think Wallace, I think the thing I would say about Wallace, let me just finish by saying this. There is obviously political factionalism in medieval Scotland, and the Scots have to navigate that in the context of civil war and national war. And I think they actually do a pretty successful job, given that there is quite a significant fault line there. One of the things that stands out for me about Wallace is that he is above factionalism. He may be tied to the Bruces, but he is perfectly capable of working. He's loyal to King John, as I said, I think earlier in the questions. His charters that survive are issued in the name of King John, and Balliol, as I said, is very much, linked to the common faction. And one of the things Wallace does as guardian is to appoint William Lamberton as Bishop of St Andrews, and Lamberton goes on to play a key role on the patriotic side as well. And Lamberton is someone who's more naturally aligned with the Commons. So I think this again adds to the distinctiveness of Wallace, and it really kind of underlines the point that for Wallace it is about the cause. It's the cause of freedom. He really epitomizes this. That is why he is fighting, and factionalism comes a significant second to that.
Thank you.
Stacey, do you have a comment or question?
There's some evidence in the record that Bruce vacillated back and forth between being Scottish or English, and perhaps that was self-preservation. But what is your thought on that?
Yeah, you're right to raise this. This got lost in the kind of line I was taking there, working through the narrative. I think the point to start at here, well, one thing to say is that the Bruces have been in Scotland since the early 12th century. So I think it's, one needs to be careful about thinking about, what they are in terms of identity. They have been naturalized, you want to put it that way, for a number of generations now. So Robert Bruce, the Bruce who becomes king, I don't think we need have any doubts about how he would have conceived of his national identity. But the identities are complex things. The Bruces, in common with most of the Scottish higher landowning classes in this period, held significant lands in England as well. And this was true of many of the English aristocracy as well. This is one of the things that really complicated the war and made the war such a difficult affair for many people. You actually have two kingdoms side by side which are getting on pretty well, and their aristocracies are interconnected, and landholding is one of the aspects of this. Bruce has a brother Alexander, who is a leading scholar at Cambridge in this period, and Bruce loses all his brothers to the war. The suffering that the war engendered was very personal for Bruce. He loses 4 brothers in the struggle, and he has a sister who spends an unspecified amount of time caged on the battlements of a castle because of her support for her brother too. The Bruces own significant lands in England. The Manor of Tottenham is one example, and the Bruces never found a church of their own in Scotland because they had already founded one in the north of England, Gisborough Priory in the north of England. That is where the Bruces are buried. So there are these complexities, which your question raises. But you also you mentioned vacillation, and I think the point to start with here is the fact that the Bruces have this claim to the throne, and they believe they come out of the great cause thinking that they have been done, that they have really lost out on the throne, and they are not going to subscribe to a balliol kingship, very readily because of that. So that's an issue. But in 1297, when Wallace when the Scots rise against the English regime in Scotland, the future king, Robert Bruce, who at this point in time, his father's still alive, he comes out on the Scottish side, which is interesting at that point in time. That's kind of quite early for him to make a move. But in 1302, he goes back into Edward's peace. And then it's after that he makes his move when all seems lost and Wallace is dead and the Scots appear to have been effectively conquered for a second time. So, some scholars have characterized it like that. This is vacillation. This is Bruce kind of hedging his bets, thinking about he perhaps more than Wallace has to think about the landed assets of the family and what's going to happen to these, etc. But I personally think that, I wouldn't see such a contrast between the Bruce after 1306 and Bruce before 1306. I think the circumstances in which he and his family find themselves are tricky.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more comment if anyone wishes to make one. We're something like 30 minutes over the time, so that shows the enthusiasm for this presentation. Professor MacGregor, your research is always stellar. Your talks are always fascinating, and we will hope to count on you again next year in 2026. We'd love to have you back. Whatever you wish to speak on. It's been grand. I can't thank you enough. Yes, I'm seeing fireworks and clappings of hands on the screen, but thank you so much. I also just hearts. So I want to thank everyone for being on every month. You're enabling us to keep Scottish history and celebration of Scottish history alive in America. And we honor and cherish each and every one of you. I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas, happy holiday season, health in the new year. And we'll see you back, fresh start, January 2026. Thank you. Thank you again, Professor.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your kind attendance and your questions. Thank you. It's been most enjoyable.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. That's great to be in your company again. And I don't know if you can take any more from me, but I'm happy to come back anytime.
Thank you. We'll count on it. I'll be asking what your date is. Good to see you, John. Good to see everybody. Thanks for joining. Bonnie, Barbara, Sue. Time to introduce everyone. George Wilson. Catherine, we'll catch you next month. We'll start with that, okay? That'd be great.
That sounds great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas all.
Paula, I'll be in touch, I promise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Connie.
Bye, Bonnie.